Happy to welcome back Farah Warner as our host for this stream as we dig into Story Worldwide. Farah?
Hey, Drew, thanks very much. It's my pleasure to welcome Simon Kelly, Josh and Craig from Story Worldwide. Simon and I met, I think, on the phone for the first time when I was working last year on our measurement and metrics research paper. So Simon, I'm going to turn it over to you to tell us more about how brand storytellers can use a century-old technique with minute-old technology in today's new reality and create deeper, immersive brand experiences that tell a brand's unique story. So over to you, Simon.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for that introduction. I would like to introduce my partners, Craig and Josh. Maybe they could say a couple of words about themselves as we think. So, Josh,
absolutely. So I'm Josh Von Shiner. I lead the story sharing team at Story Worldwide, all about building audiences around our content.
And I'm Craig Tepper. I'm the chief story runner at Story Worldwide. It is a hybrid creative and production role that we'll get into in detail in this presentation.
Fantastic. All right. So we really want to answer the question, which is how do you create brand narratives and brand stories in these really challenging times? And there are really two parts to that. The first part is really making sure that you have an ownable narrative. And I don't know if you wanted, if you had any questions for me, or if you wanted me to to set that up.
Yeah, let's just start right away in talking about sort of your the way that you've brought together story finding and then I think story runners. So why don't we just start off with your approach at Story around story finding and how that really helps brands determine who they are, not necessarily what they do or what they make, but I love this idea of figuring out what who a brand is. So if you could discuss sort of how you do that and maybe give us a few ideas of a couple of tools that Story uses in this process.
Yeah, absolutely. So story finding, as the name suggests, is really we dig deep into the brand's narrative. And the end result of this finding process is what we call a story platform. It's a narrative, it's 3 or 4 words that describe the ownable and authentic truth of the brand, and the ownable part is something that we'll talk a little bit more about. It's sort of based on the early days of Story. The original co-founder with me was an investigative journalist, somebody that you know, Kirk Schaefer, who was he was a Pulitzer Prize finalist for the Detroit Free Press, actually, for his investigative work. And our story finding process looks a lot like that. We dig really deep into the brand's truth. And it's really, if I had $1 for every time a brand told us, particularly in the CPG space, that they were fresh and natural and all the rest of it, when nothing could be further from the truth, then I'd have at least, I don't know, $20 in my wallet right now. And it's really sort of based on, well, okay, so that's great. You may be fresh, you may be natural, actually you're not, but let's just assume that you are. Those are table stakes for the category you're in. So let's find something else that looks more deeply at what's ownable by you and only by you. So that's really that sort of investigative, finding the truth of the brand is really important for us. And I guess, it's developed over the last 10 or 15 years. It's really, my background was in magazine publishing, and as you know, from a journalistic point of view, every editor, every magazine, every media outlet on the planet has a platform, a sort of narrative platform that defines its authority to publish. You build you build trust with an audience by delivering this sort of consistent point of view. It's so that this platform's narrative sort of becomes a lens by which you deliver content and by which you create media and content out of events that are happening, and you build trust by having that sort of consistent lens over time. And in defining that authority to publish, it means that you have to go really deep into the audience. And more often than not, brands think they know who they are and what they stand for, but more often than not, they don't. It's that they're basing their decisions on data. And as a famous professor, whose name I always forget, in the 60s at Stanford said that data is the plural of narrative. It's the plural of anecdotes. And we absolutely believe that. And actually, Jeff Bezos said something very similar a year ago when he said, you know what, we're Amazon, we love data. Obviously, if we can get things to you more quickly, then we'll do it. But I love anecdotes, and more often than not, when the anecdotes and the data disagree, the anecdotes prevail. So that's really the part of the process. And just to add, various brand storytelling events, Elevate and so on. I've had conversations with a lot of storytellers who said, look, we're struggling. We create great content. We've got this fantastic studio. We're creating great content. But oftentimes our clients say that's a great story, but it's not our story. It's, our competitors could tell that story. And so that's where we come in and we say, well, before you create a story, you better know what your ownable narrative is and how it differentiates you from your competition. Only then do you have authority and permission to start telling stories from your audience. So that process could be anything from a 6-week sprint to a three-month sort of in-depth discovery process with workshops and stakeholder interviews, and pest analyses, and as well as then the sort of the strategy and the creative teams come together to sort of start pulling those stories together. A lot of, again, the investigative part of it is where we sort of take those data points and say, well, that's really interesting, but why does that exist? That's kind of what people say, but why are they saying it? And that's where there's no substitute for actually talking to the customers, the brand's customers, and when really understanding and listening to their stories. And only then can you really get a sense of how the brand can then turn those stories into their own story, because it's, they've done that research. So there are all kinds of, sorry, go ahead.
It's okay. I was in this moment, in this year, I think this story finding process must be very interesting for brands as we all work in a world, and interestingly in journalism, we are having a lot of discovery and questions about our audience, about their trust in us, about whether they've ever trusted us, particularly communities of color, as we move through not just this moment, but sort of moving through this long process. Have you been experiencing this with brands this year, where storytelling and story finding really helps them find their true purpose with their audiences, so they're not just doing performative actions around sort of people of color, which is of the moment right now, but in fact are really doing the work? Anything you can talk about there, because I think that's on the top of minds for a lot of brands this year. How do they engage with these audiences?
Absolutely, and I think it's, again, the understanding their authority with different audiences is absolutely key, and a lot of the processes that we have to be able to do that, and the rigor that we go through. And I think every brand should do that, particularly not just in terms of planning campaigns and what should the messaging look like, and it obviously has to ladder back to their purpose, to why they exist. You can't in this sort of, in the scheme of things, sort of the linear process looks something like, okay, why do we exist? And so let's really understand our purpose. How are we going to serve our communities beyond the shareholders? It's no longer any, it's no longer sufficient to just line the shareholders' pockets. Typically there's a much higher purpose, and our audience doesn't care They don't, that they want to understand why you exist and what are you doing for me, and whoever that audience is. And so if you don't understand that, then you better start finding out pretty quickly, because they're going to find you out soon. And a lot of the sorry, go ahead.
Hey, Simon, I'd love to bring Josh and Craig into talking about their roles at Story in association with this conversation that we're having on purpose. Josh, from your perspective this year, how has the work that Story does, with story finding and your work, how has that been helping brands really find their purpose this year?
Right. So in order to react to all the myriad cultural events happening, whether it's wildfires in California and where do brands stand on environmentalism, or Black Lives Matter and where do brands stand on their racial past, what have you, whatever that moment is right now, a brand that doesn't understand their holistic narrative isn't able to respond and know what their role needs to be in these various events. And what happens is we get kind of knee-jerk reactions. We get statements that ring hollow with our audiences, and the stakes could never be higher. So we see kind of across the board that these brand narratives take on a much more elevated role, and brands can't kind of skip through or skip that step like they can in kind of culturally calmer times.
Craig, what about from your perspective, and maybe tell us a little bit about this sort of anchor on the other side of story finding with Story Runner. How are you seeing your role as a story runner in these times?
Just very quickly at a high level to define the idea of the story runner. It's essentially taking the showrunner model from television and applying it to brand storytelling. And we'll get into more detail on that later. I think when you're working with a brand that's done this work, that has a narrative in place, that understands their purpose, the work that we're currently doing isn't in reaction to anything, right? The work we're doing now is the work, in a lot of ways, the work we would be doing if all of these myriad social and environmental and political events weren't taking place. We're doing work that is true to who the brand is, what their story is, and how they'd want to tell it. That how part is changing. That how part is changing because we can't do things the way we would have when we were all free to kind of go about our business and be in the same room at the same time and live life the way we have up until a few months ago. So with the purpose being in place, with the narrative being in place, we're able to focus simply on how we change the the difference in the way we make things, but not necessarily in what we're making. It's not so much that the stories themselves are telling, the stories themselves are changing. These are not knee-jerk reactions. These are not quick pivots in terms of who the brand is claiming to be. It's more that we're kind of pivoting in the way that we do the storytelling. It's more that we're changing the methods we use in making. And that core solid foundation, that authority to publish is already in place. So we can just change the way we publish.
Got it. Great. Simon, I know I know you want to get to a couple of clips, but one thing I wanted to go back to in this is I always love for our audience to get maybe just a little insight or a tool. So could you talk about story circles or archetypes, and just give us a little bit of not the full story experience, but is there one tool that you really think helps brands find who they are?
Yes. Actually, I think if I had to pick one, if I was on a desert island and I could only take one tool with me, it would be the archetype process. It's based on the hero and the outlaw, which I'm sure lots of people are familiar with, where the author identified 12 different brand archetypes that typically most brands can fit into one or two of those particular archetypes. So it's the process, we look at, we actually do it with the audience first, and then we do it with the team, with the marketing team, just to compare notes. And so we saved the green giant with our archetype process. He was America's icon, was about to be thrown under the bus by General Mills. Boo, his. And because they were using data, and so when we went through the archetype exercise, they picked the innocent. It was, you know, imagine Florence Nightingale. You know, they saw the Green Giant as somebody who was benign, benevolent, but kind of powerless. You know, there wasn't much energy there. But when we, time after time after time that we tested that with the audience, they picked the hero, and it was Russell Crowe in The Gladiator, and they were just astonished, and we showed them all of those datums and so on, and it saved his life. They wouldn't go as far as the hero, so we created the 13th blended archetype, which was the protector, which was the image. Imagine Obi-Wan Kenobi, sort of seemingly benign, but you don't want to piss him off because he's got a lightsaber and the Force is with him. So that was, this work was probably done 7 or 8 years ago, but if you look at even today, the billboards and the TV spots, you can see that narrative. But the platform we came up with them for was the natural guardian of growing, and you'll see that that narrative is still being told today, and that archetype exercise was one of the ways that we were able to get them to do that. So yeah.
Thanks. So I know that you have some clips that you want to show us because you're going to take us on a bit of a deeper dive into one of your clients. So if you want to set that up, and then I know Drew's got the video ready to go.
Yeah. We wanted to get really practical and specific and take everybody on a journey from the story finding through to making and sharing with one particular client, which is ARM, who have been in the news recently because they just got acquired on Monday by NVIDIA for $40 billion, who bought them from SoftBank. So our ARM client was going to be with us today, but she is a little busy right now being acquired. This ARM's platform that we came up with, and in case anybody is unfamiliar with them, they're a semiconductor builder, or not builder, a designer, I should say, working with Apple and Samsung and Google, and they're in 95% of mobile devices around the planet, including VR headsets as well as mobile phones and so on. So their overall umbrella narrative that we worked with them on 4 years ago was the architects of possible. They don't build anything, they don't make anything, but they architect. And then more recently, they have one of their divisions, and the biggest division is the IP division for mobile chips. And they wanted a specific narrative for that, given the fact that they are all engineers, given the fact that everything from AI to self-driving cars to VR headsets to this call or this meeting that we're having is all powered by ARM chips. This wouldn't have been possible 5 years ago without ARM. And their model as well, the open source sort of partnership model makes this happen. So we created, again, going through our process, going through the stakeholder interviews, all of that, a narrative for them, which is ownable by them, which is engineering a new reality. And so they loved it, and they said, great, how do we bring that to life? So we created a series, which Josh is going to talk about, and then we'll show the clip.
Right. So as we move from story finding to story making process, story finding is an investigative journalist approach. Our story making process is a documentary filmmaking approach in order to continue that authentic storytelling. So in order to do that, in this particular case, our campaign or our series is called the New Reality Series, which documents how in the last 6 months, the acceleration of the adoption of communication technologies. We're telecommuting a lot more. We're meeting with doctors online versus going into an office. We're gaming with friends and family in VR headsets that people didn't have last year. All these different ways that we can connect with each other now that we didn't previously, all powered by this technology innovated by ARM. And in order to do that, we wanted to tell this story via video, via podcasts, via quick kind of snackable content on social media. We wanted to bring in third-party voices to help tell the story as well. And quickly, traditional kind of creative agency process proved to be too slow, not dynamic enough. You have a creative director over here, and then you have a production company with the actual filmmaker way over here, and we couldn't have the actual makers that far away from the creative process. So as Craig mentioned, we created the story runner role to bring the actual content makers and storytellers further up in that creative process. And in this case, the result is a new reality series, which I think we can check out that trailer. Now, Craig will share a little bit on how that story runner process actually works and how we brought the series to life.
Sure. One interesting thing about this series, the story finding process, all of that research and all of that strategy occurred before COVID really became an issue here in the States. So our initial thoughts on it, our initial planning around it had nothing to do with the situation we found ourselves in when it came time to bring the campaign to market. So we had to find a way to very quickly pivot to alternate forms of production and new ways of thinking about storytelling. One of the things that's really interesting, and going back to the idea of the authority to publish, is that ARMS has this unique situation. Their IP is in, as Simon mentioned, about 95% of mobile phones. It's in VR headsets, tablets, routing devices that are part of internet infrastructure, etc. And right away, we realized that we had the ability to leverage the fact that ARMS IP was in all of these mobile devices that are in the hands of so many of us as our method for storytelling. So we decided that we could move forward using mobile devices as the tools we use to tell these stories. So that means that even despite the limitations we all have now in the ways that we can make things, the ways that we can tell stories, the ways that we can do a production, we were in a unique position with this client and their authority to publish to use these tools as our method of storytelling. So we're able to do remote production as everyone is now, and virtual production, and all of these methods that we might not necessarily have chosen had the circumstances been different, but they actually help make the case for this idea of engineering a new reality. There's a new reality that we're living in, which is part of the story, but there's also the new reality that lays ahead. The development cycle at ARM is about a 5-year process. The technology we all have in our pockets right now was begun by them 5 years ago. So the series kind of bridges this idea between the reality we're all living in and coping with, and what we can expect in the future, and it goes between both. I'm going to show you guys a couple of examples to set things up. The first is a trailer from a very quick 15-second trailer from our first episode, and that involves some remote production, which we'll talk about, and then we'll get into something else after that.
Technology is human imagination literalized. Technology is the embodiment of human creativity in the world. It comes through us and from us, and therefore it belongs to us.
So Josh had mentioned this idea of bringing in voices from outside of ARM, and there was an example of that, and I think Josh will talk a little bit more about that. That's Jason Silva, who's a television host and futurist, and he was one of the people we brought in to kind of talk about the future of mobile technology. And also, it's an example of remote production. Jason, we were fortunate enough that he was in Iceland when our shooting schedule took place. And he used a mobile device powered by ARM technology to shoot a bunch of video content for us based on conversations that we had with him. He has a certain area of expertise. We used a journalistic documentary filmmaking approach to pull a narrative about the future out of him, and then we set up a remote shoot where he went out and created content for us. Josh, do you want to jump in quickly and talk about that kind of role, and then I'll come back and talk about the next steps?
Yeah, certainly. So the most credible voice in the room isn't always the brand directly, right? I don't think I'm saying anything super innovative there. I think at this point, many of us realize that. So what we wanted to do in kind of structuring our program and making sure we were addressing two things. One, the authenticity and the credibility of the message, and two, making sure that we had a captive audience in a world where everyone can just swipe right past brand content in most scenarios. So what we did is we brought in all these really credible voices. I would call them influencers, but they don't necessarily have Instagram channels. They're not influencers as we think of them today. You know, so illustrative examples of people from this program, Jason Silva, we just saw. He's a futurist, he's a technologist, he's a host with National Geographic. The host of our overall program was John Romero, who founded id Software. They more or less invented the first-person shooter in creating Doom. We brought in Nick Feit, who's the CEO and founder of Rec Room, the largest VR platform in the world. We brought in Timothy West, who leads XR for Unity, the largest mobile visual engine out there. And then to make sure that we had reach while still credibly delivering this message, our media partners TechCrunch, to make sure that you know, their stamp of approval goes a long way with this kind of audience as well. And our podcast was hosted by Jeff Wheelwright, a technology journalist for the last 20 years. So this kind of collective group of people helping to share this message kind of lends a lot of credibility to the overall story that we're trying to tell.
And then in addition to remote production, something that gave us an opportunity to really show off the technology, to show just how much mobile devices can now do, and also gave us a little bit more control over the production itself and the visual aspects of the production, was to do some virtual production. Josh had just mentioned Rec Room, which is a platform we featured in our second episode, and we were able to shoot an entire episode in Rec Room with multiple cameras in multiple locations, completely in a virtual environment. I mean, we spent the day with a VR helmet on, and I was kind of surprised that so much of what one does on a normal location shoot, you know, yelling to get people out of frame, trying to get everyone's attention, et cetera, all the things a director normally does on set, one had to do in the virtual world as well. But we were able to kind of get something that was very, not only illustrative of the power of the technology that we were featuring, and capturing a kind of vision of the future, but also gave us a very traditional production experience in a virtual world. And we have a short clip of that to share.
We've even seen people meet inside of Rec Room and then decide to get married outside of Rec Room. Close your fists and then give me a little fist bump. This is how you party up.
Yeah.
Nice. Yeah. Whoa. Oh, wow. Look at that.
Just a very quick tease of what happened in that episode. But so again, across this series, not only are we working in video, but also podcasts. Each time we feature a new episode of the series, a different mobile technology platform is featured, and different experts from outside of ARM are featured, along with people at ARM who can kind of go more in depth into the technology.
Great, thank you, Craig, and thank you, Josh. And I just want to point out to our attendees, you can definitely drop your questions into the Q&A. And I'm going to jump in, and because there's a really good one in there, and the question comes from John Gaunt. What's your advice to content creators in particular, for those of us who produce thought leadership and similar? What's changed and what hasn't? When you meet content creators, what are you listening for that indicates the creator has grokked the new realities? Not sure who wants to take that, but maybe I'll throw it to Craig, to you first.
I would say the biggest thing that's changed is that nothing has changed, right? I mean, you still, the principles of storytelling are still the same. Listening to your client, doing your research, planning, all of the things that go into storytelling are the same. The thing that has changed is, certain things have become certain things have become easier to do. I mean, literally creating an entire series from your living room is now possible. But most of it has stayed the same. I would say the biggest thing to keep in mind is to kind of, at one level, is to let go of some ideas about approaches and aesthetics that you can kind of let go of, and embrace the quickness of the technology. Embrace the ability to kind of move forward. If you've done all your homework, you can move forward with making in a very free and quick way, as long as you kind of let go of some of the old ideas that you might have from the way we've always done production. But for the most part, I think the principles are the same.
I completely agree, and I think that what's happening in pretty much every aspect of our lives is that everything is just accelerated by a factor of 100. So if you think 25 years ago, there was this thing called the internet that changed our lives forever, and storytelling, was basically print, TV, and some traditional channels. And then so along came the internet, and then along came email, and then along came mobile technology, and then along came social media, and then along came influencers, and now there's mixed reality and virtual reality and all many different other ways in which you can create content and share that content. But each of those new ways of telling stories and communicating with audiences, evolved over a period of 3 years or 5 years, and then it was 2 years, and maybe it was one. There was sort of we were in this sort of accelerated chamber that was just throwing out these new channels. And now it's like every week there's a new way, talking to, as we're creating the series and talking to all of these sort of new platforms and channels, and how they're having to pivot and very, very quickly to build audience, and not least, of course, the demand that it has on infrastructure and everything else. But as a content creator, I think that, as Craig says, not much has changed other than the speed with which and the nimbleness that you have to have in order to embrace these sort of new channels and new devices.
Yep.
Yeah, I thought it. And Josh, I was going to jump to you because somebody had a great question. And so let's do that, and then I'll come back to my question and comment. So go ahead, Josh.
Maybe the only thing I would add is I think content creators, maybe more so than they have historically, need to be aware of where and how and the context in which one will consume whatever content that's being created, and who may ultimately deliver that message. Historically, if you made a 30-second spot, didn't matter necessarily all the time what show it showed up in. If you made a print ad, it didn't necessarily always matter which magazine it showed up in. But as we make content like this, we needed to understand, as we worked with Rec Room and Nick, fight what their channels might be that might help promote this, and how our audience felt about that particular platform before we pitched the idea and before we kind of planned out the series.
Right.
Josh, and to the team, there was a question, and if you want to put it up into the chat, where somebody asked where we could actually watch the series.
Yes, and I tried to answer it. Here we go. There we go.
If you want to put it in the,
yep.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, I think what was really interesting about even watching just those little bits of the new reality is, my thought was how much story still matters.
Mm-hmm.
And that, you know, and when you strip away all the like needing to go on set and do all that, we can get really caught up in the making of the thing, as opposed to the thing that we are, the story that we are making, the thing that we are telling. And that the sort of speed of the technology then kind of allows us to get those stories out even more quickly. I think it's going to be really interesting to see just where VR takes off in the next couple of years. Now we're in this space, we're at home. How do we connect with each other, not just on Zoom, but in different spaces? Simon, you were going to jump in. I think you had a comment around that last question around content creation.
Yeah, and I think it's also you know, it pertains to your point too, which is, you know, when you're thinking about, you know, using these new tools and new platforms, new devices, new ways of connecting with your fellow citizens, you know, you think about the journey that you're going to take them on, you know, and I think it's increasingly important to think about the ecosystem, you know. I think, and that's something that you know, a lot of brands are beginning to recognize, is that it's not good enough to have, you know, one agency creating a more traditional media story over here, and then your PR agency doing this, and your social agency doing that, and your tech agency or virtual reality, mixed reality agency doing that. Because there's a couple of things that happen. One is that you end up with different stories being told, or different narratives being told, because each agency has a different, they're wedded to a particular channel. So I think it's really important to think about, well, okay, so we're going to do a video, and then we're going to do a podcast, and then we're going to share snippets of those stories and tease the audience using influencers and using sort of media outlets. But it's all part of this connected ecosystem. So I think that's, you know, one of the things, and I really do believe that, you know, in order to really sort of captivate the imagination of your audience, you've got to really think about how you can go deeper. One more, how do you provide more? How do you take them on that journey?
Yeah, that's one of the foundational aspects of the whole story runner role, was to have someone in charge of how that story is told across different platforms and different media. You know, just as a showrunner sits in a writer's room and different writers go off and write different episodes of a series, but the showrunner has to make sure that it sounds like one voice, and it's a similar idea. And so in this particular series, our video content gets to a certain level of depth in terms of technology, and then the podcasts go a bit deeper. We change who the guests are. We go to people who are at a more kind of senior technical level at ARM to be a voice there. And it's really about how you manage this. But, you know, it all comes from that core, from that very beginning story finding, those exercises that lead to the platform, that lead to the narrative. Once that's set, it's a matter of keeping things, you know, measuring things by degree, and deploying different methods of storytelling in different media that best suit.
We have another question that's in the Q&A, and I'll let it go to any of you. Shlomi Ron writes, what is the typical misconception about brand storytelling you're coming across these days, and how do you address it?
That's a great question. What springs to mind for me is the misconception that brand storytelling is a temporary fad, that it's just a new sexy new toy that marketers have found to dress up advertising or content that they've always produced under the guise of storytelling. It's not, you know, it's witness the fact that, you know, the brand storytelling organization, thank you for hosting us, by the way, you know, that it exists and is growing, and you know, every time I go to an event or you know, watch a live stream, the growing band of storytellers that are out there have created this momentum, and it's really it's not a fad. This is given, and especially given the role of technology in enabling consumers to dictate pretty much how and when they receive messages from brands. Storytelling is the only way that mankind has ever created an emotional reaction in anybody else. And that's, it's here to stay. And I think, it'll replace, storytelling will replace traditional advertising over time, and is already doing that. And so I think there's this misconception that it's sort of a fad that will go away and there'll be a new fad that comes, in 5 years' time. It ain't going away.
I think one of the misconceptions also is that there's a short shelf life on a brand narrative, and that the brand narrative needs to be reevaluated every time a new campaign is coming out. I think a good brand narrative, it's anchored to the brand, it's anchored to the company. They're there for a very long time. You can come up with different activations, different executions, different campaigns in order to communicate that narrative in a new way, but the narrative itself shouldn't be changing.
I would say the biggest, the thing that jumps out most to me is this idea that content is just something that you push down a pipe. It's just there to fill a hole. It's just there to fill a container. And and as Josh was just saying, things have a long shelf life now. With the internet, things are out there forever. And if you are telling a meaningful story and you tell it well, it is a meaningful work in and of itself. It's not just content that you shove down a pipe. It's an actual story that somebody can get something from.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Just this idea that content is a commodity, that it just is this sort of thing. I used to always have really big issues with calling it content, and I do like the phrase storytelling much better, and particularly brand storytelling. And I think that brings us in a bit kind of full circle from where we started off in the beginning, is talking about sort of purpose and the moment and the times that we're living through. Is that story and its longevity are what are really important and probably sustaining for a brand, as opposed to that mindset of just content that runs down a pipe. So I can kind of create whatever I want for that moment, but it may not. But again, it may be performative. It may not actually be deeply felt or deeply understood, or come with the work that needs to come from that. We've got about 5 minutes left. We don't have to take up all that time. We don't have anything else in the Q&A. Any final comments or thoughts? Simon, I'll throw it to you, and then maybe Josh and Craig, we can wrap it up.
I would just, I think if one thing that defines really good storytelling better than anything else is the audience, where you have the rigor to involve the audience in the story, and co-creating that story makes it way more powerful. And then getting people to that same audience that created the story to share those stories with their communities and share them with their communities makes it all the more powerful. So it's all about audience, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I think also audiences can tell what's authentic storytelling and what isn't. I mean, to your point, Farah, what you were just talking about. I mean, you can try and do these have these performative actions, but I think people can tell the difference. And I think that a story there's always two sides to it. There's the storyteller, and there's the person who is listening and processing and taking something away from that story. And as Simon just said, that is a complete cycle and needs to be, something that's always kept in mind.
Josh, you get the final word.
Yeah, I would say advertising's gotten a lot harder. The audience isn't captive anymore. They're not going to sit on the couch for 30 seconds in between segments of their favorite show. They're consuming content in different locations that allow them to skip through content. And we're assaulted by more and more brand messages. So the attention span is shortening. The only way around that is to tell more compelling, emotional stories that make people want to be captive. And I think that's where we will kind of gain back some of that effectiveness that have been lost over the last 20 years.
Great. Well, thank you. Thanks so much, Simon, for inviting me to moderate today. It was a pleasure to see you. And I am, and to meet Josh and to meet Craig. I'm going to turn it back to Drew from Brand Storytelling. Drew?
Thanks, Farah. If you're just joining us or if you happen to miss a portion of this stream, fear not. We'll be publishing on YouTube as of tomorrow, so you can check it out there and see the full stream. Thanks so much, Simon and Josh and Craig, for joining us from Story Worldwide. And thank you, Farah, for coming back to host this session. Take care, everyone. Stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Bye.
Thanks.